Welcome to Dead Souls Social Club.
This audio presentation contains graphic details of death, violence, and controversial subject matter. Listener discretion is strongly advised. From Dead Souls Media, this is Hitler, Part 2, The Occult. I'm Jamie Black, a researcher and psychologist, and I'll be your host for tonight. In the previous episode, we talked about the stranger facets of Adolf Hitler's character, the person that he was behind closed doors, and the man that very few people really knew. But to get to know and understand Hitler's behaviours, we will also need to look at his mindset, at his beliefs and world vision. Tonight is part 2 of a 3-part series into the strange world of Adolf Hitler, genocidal madman, drug-addled and hate-filled lunatic, and egocentric extremist who believed that the entire world should exist, operate and rest in solely his maniacal vision. Imagine that. In May 1933, all across Germany, students, brown shirts, and Hitler youth gathered often and en masse to burn books by the thousands. Works of literature, philosophy, and science, believed to be un-German, were lost forever to the flames of hate. Adolf Hitler has declared war on reason and knowledge. The Nazis wanted to eliminate ideas, thinking, and people who were not aligned to Nazi cultural alignment. So they promoted a campaign of cultural and ideological censorship. Books by Jewish, communist, socialist, pacifist, and liberal authors in particular were targeted. Any writings or articles that condemned Nazism or supported the Weimar Republic were also eradicated. It was a symbolic attack intended to culturally purify German culture, to reset literature and herald in an era of state control and the suppression of dissent. Hitler's revolt against the intellect will refresh and enshrine in a new religion. A religion devoted to the mysteries of blood and race. Old esoteric beliefs would be brought back into the public perception once again. Adolf Hitler declares the secret knowledge of nature, of the divine, the shapeless and the demonic, will emerge. The German people will wash off the Christian veneer and create a religion particular to what Hitler called, quote, our own race. The religion of blood, which Hitler speaks of, will pave the way for the murder of millions across Europe. You see, the Nazis' so-called creed of race is not of Hitler's own creation. It's something he himself discovered from others. Its roots come from the teachings of Germanic mystics and the doctrines of the occult from the Germany of the 1890s. A more mystical and occultist period where alternative, Far Eastern, ancient and metaphysical beliefs were commonplace in Europe and the United States. Where spiritualism and necromantic practices were widespread. In 1871, there was an overwhelming sense of promise with the birth of the Second German Reich, with the crowning of Kaiser Wilhelm. Yet the romantic hope for a nation of stability and order had failed to materialize. This was because behind this medieval ceremony and pomp of the Kaiser's court, there is the deep upheaval of a global industrial revolution. The Second Reich is poorly timed. But there are elements of that medieval and mystical era that the Nazis want to reinstate in Germany.
Ich will auch ein ganz schweres Kapitel, will ich hier vor Ihnen in aller Offenheit nennen.
This is the voice of Heinrich Himmler, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany.
Und trotzdem werden wir nicht in der Öffentlichkeit nie darüber reden. Genauso wenig, wie wir am 30. Juni gezögert haben.
He is speaking at a gathering of SS soldiers in Poznan, Poland, on the 4th of October, 1943.
Wie wir darüber niemals gesprochen haben und sprechen werden. Das war so eine, Gott sei Dank, in uns wohnende Takt. Selbstverständlichkeit des Taktes.
He is talking openly about how it is the SS soldiers' duty to murder all of the Jews, but keep tight-lipped about it.
Geschaut, und jeder war sich klar, dass es das nächste Mal wieder tun würde, wenn es befohlen wird. Und wenn es
It is their duty, he reminds them.
Ich meine, die Judenevakuierung,
Never will they speak of their monstrous actions.
es gehört zu den
He then
Dingen, die
finishes
man leicht ausspricht.
with a brief laugh
Das jüdische Volk wird
at their planned disposal of millions of innocent lives.
Programm drin. Ausschaltung der Juden, Ausrottung, machen wir, Kleinigkeit.
Heinrich Himmler, the fourth Reichsfuhrer of the Schutzstaffel, commonly referred to as the SS, was a leading member of the Nazi Party. He was one of the most powerful members of the Nazi leadership and Hitler's second in command, following the downfall of Hermann Göring. Well, Himmler was himself a devout practitioner of the occult and mystic rituals. Himmler was known to conduct dark rituals with his SS officers. They would sit around a circular table, surrounded by occult symbols, believing that they were channeling ancient Aryan powers. This wasn't fiction. This was the Third Reich. Adolf Hitler and his inner circle were obsessed with the occult. Astrology, mysticism, supernatural artifacts and ancient prophecies. They believed these dark forces would help them conquer the world. This is the history that they didn't intend you to find out. The Thule Society and the Birth of Evil. To understand Hitler's occult obsession, we must go back to the year 1918. Germany had just lost the First World War. The country was in chaos, both economically devastated and politically unstable. It was humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles. In Munich, a secret occult society was meeting low-key. That society was called the Thule Society. The Thule Society was founded by Rudolf von Sebottendorf, a German occultist and writer who was obsessed with ancient mysticism and racial purity. The Thule's members believed in a mystical lost civilization called Thule, which was supposedly located in the frozen north, near modern-day Iceland or Greenland. According to their somewhat unique beliefs, Thule was the original homeland of the Aryan race, a superior race of godlike beings which they believed held mystical and supernatural powers. The so-called Aryan race has now been widely discredited as being an actual historic race by scientists, historians and anthropologists. They are a pseudo-scientific historical race, a concept that was co-opted and manipulated in 19th and early 20th century German racist ideologues. The Aryan concept derived from the notion that the original speakers of the Indo-European language were distinct and superior specimens of humankind, and thus their genetic descendants, right up to the present day, constitute a distinctive categorization of the Caucasian race, opposed to, and alongside, the Semitic race and the Hamitic race. This approach to categorizing human population groups is entirely false and misguided, however. It's biologically meaningless due to the genetic similarity mixing and complex interrelationships between each of these groups over the centuries. The only individual and singular race in existence factually is Homo sapiens, or the human race. Anything else is merely a cultural construct. Now, the Thule Society claimed that modern Germans were descendants of these ancient Aryans, and that they needed to purify their bloodlines in order to reclaim their true supernatural heritage. To join the Thule Society, members had to sign a blood declaration of faith, swearing that no Jewish or other coloured blood flowed in their veins or their wives' veins. This racist pseudoscience would later become the foundation of National Socialist ideology. The Thule Society attracted around 1,500 followers in the southeastern German state of Bavaria initially. Among them were some names that you might recognize. They were Rudolf Hess, who would later become appointed Deputy Führer of Germany under Adolf Hitler, before he crashed a small plane into Scotland in 1941 in an attempt to negotiate peace with the British. Alfred Rosenberg. Rosenberg was the head of the Reich Ministry for the occupied Eastern Territories between 1941 to 1945. He helped direct the mass murder of the Slavic people of Eastern Europe during the war. He was also the head of the German Office of Foreign Affairs during the entire rule of Nazi Germany, and also headed the Rosenberg Bureau, the official Nazi body for cultural policy and internal surveillance. Rosenberg introduced Adolf Hitler to the next name on our list, Dietrich Eckart. Eckart was a German playwright, journalist, and political activist who was one of the founders of the German Nazi Party. He was a huge influence on the mindset and beliefs of Adolf Hitler. In fact, Eckart was perceived amongst the National Socialist hierarchy as a major thinker and influencer upon the establishment of Nazi Germany. He was acknowledged by Hitler himself to be the, quote, the spiritual co-founder of Nazism and a guiding light of the early National Socialist movement. Then finally, we have Hans Frank. He was a senior German Nazi politician and lawyer who had gone to serve as the head of the General Government, a puppet entity created by Germany to rule over newly acquired German-occupied Polish lands during the Second World War. Frank rose to become Adolf Hitler's personal legal advisor, and as the Nazis rose to power, he would also serve as the Nazi Party's official lawyer, representing the National Socialist Party in over 2,400 cases by 1938 alone. In January 1919, Thule Society member Anton Drexler founded a small political group called the, quote, Deutsche Arbeiter Party, or the German Workers' Party. 9 months later, a failed artist and war veteran named Adolf Hitler would walk into one of their meetings. Hitler joined as member number 55 within a year of first attending. He had taken control of the party and renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party. Hitler was careful to choose this name for the party. Socialism had a strong following in Germany amongst the voting public at the time. By giving the party a name with socialist in the title, would draw people in to see what the party was about and lend their ears. But Hitler and the other party members all knew there was nothing socialist about their politics or beliefs. Far from it. The National Socialist German Workers' Party were an entirely far right-wing organization. Nationalistic, violent, and fiercely bigoted to anyone different or whom they didn't approve of. To call themselves socialists was pure propaganda, and that was the plan from day one. The occult society had birthed a monster. Hitler and his supernatural beliefs. So exactly how deep did Hitler's personal belief in the occult go? What were the specifics of what the man genuinely held firm belief in? Well, while Hitler publicly distanced himself from overt occultism, for example, never officially joining the Thule Society, behind closed doors and away from the public eye was a very different story. You have to remember that every single aspect of the Nazi Party, the Third Reich, Adolf Hitler and senior hierarchy of the Nazi political elite was all very carefully curated, written, and heavily propagandized to ensure the image of them was always exactly as they intended. To have the influence and persuasion on the masses that it specifically required. The propaganda was so well curated that even though the Nazis are now seen as one of the most evil political ideologies and political structures in history, there are many aspects of their structure, propaganda methods, and for lack of a better phrase, public marketing, that is still used by governments the world over. governments on both sides of the political spectrum. Hitler was deeply influenced by mystical and supernatural thinking. Hitler and top Nazis exploited popular German occult, pseudoscientific and pagan ideas. Things like Welthislehre, or World Ice Theory, which was proposed by Hans Horbiger in 1894. Horbiger, an Austrian engineer and inventor, through a vision proposed that ice was the basic substance of all cosmic processes. Thus, ice moons, ice planets, and the global ether had determined the entire development of the universe, in Horbiger's view. Additionally, Ariosophy, or the esoteric wisdom of the Aryan race, astrology and racial myths such as that of the existence of German links to Atlantis, was to fuel the Nazi Völkisch ideology. For clarity, Völkische Bewegung was a folkish pan-German ethno-nationalist movement which was populist, nationalist, and entirely racist. It blended mysticism with racial purity and anti-Christian sentiment. There was no factual science whatsoever to it. The Nazis, in fact, had to create, or fake the science behind it, to convince the people. But Hitler was obsessed with astrology and prophecy. He regularly consulted astrologers and believed in supernatural destiny. Spiritualists passed messages to Hitler from important historic figures to lead his politics and thought. But at the same time, Hitler was also aware that some of the more out there esoteric beliefs that his party championed were entirely fake. Hitler also knew that the, quote, Völkisch stuff was a way to bring the people in. Hitler did have a belief in hidden realms like Shambhala, Agartha, and mythical Hyperborea, and the SS was sent in search of these. Himmler, as we know, was a firm and fervent believer in the occult, so he was only happy to oblige in using his battalions to track down these things. Himmler created the Annenberg department of the SS that specifically searched for diverse historic relics and places of a mostly imagined Aryan ancestry. Hitler, along with Himmler, hatched the plan to have the SS track down the Holy Grail to provide the forces of the Third Reich to achieve eternal life. There was never a search for the Ark of the Covenant, however. That was pure Steven Spielberg. In 1939, a Swiss astrologer named Karl Ernst Kraft predicted an assassination attempt on Hitler's life. On November 8, 1939, a bomb exploded at the Burger Brewkeller in Munich. The blast killed 8 people. Hitler had just left the beer hall just minutes before, and Kraft had warned that Hitler's life would be in danger between November 7th and November 10th. Hitler was fascinated by this prediction. He ordered Joseph Goebbels, his propaganda minister, to investigate the phenomenon. Goebbels quickly recruited Kraft and other astrologers to create fake prophecies to demoralize the Allies. If there was any truth to Kraft's abilities, it would be lost in the manipulation and exploitation of Goebbels' utilization of Kraft as a propaganda tool. They manipulated the prophecies of Nostradamus and cherry-picked Bible verses, changing words and passages from both to predict German victory and a positive view of the 1,000-year German Reich ideology. These fake prophecies were distributed across occupied France and other countries as a psychological warfare. The Nazi leadership's belief in astrology reached absurd levels in May of 1941, when Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, a member of the Thule Society himself if you remember, secretly flew to Scotland for an unauthorized peace mission. Hess decided to attempt to bring Great Britain to the negotiating table by travelling there himself to seek meetings with the British government, without Hitler's knowledge. On the 31st of August 1940, Hess met with Karl Haushofer, a German general, professor and diplomat. Haushofer told Hess that he believed that King George VI of Britain was opposed to Winston Churchill and would dismiss him and send him into exile in Canada at the first opportunity. Haushofer couldn't have been more wrong in this assumption, however. Haushofer spoke to Hess and shared his belief that it would be possible to make contact with the king via the Duke of Hamilton, a friend of Haushofer's from before the war, and a fellow aviator whom Hess figured he could relate to. You see, Hess knew and shared Hitler's respect and fondness for the British. They felt that the German people had a shared common and cultural history interwoven with their own, and held high regard for Britain and its empire. They regretted that they were at war with them, and their natural enemies were to the east, the Russians. Hess took off on his mission to make peace with the British at 5:45 p.m. on the 10th of May 1941, flying from the airfield at Augsburg, Honstetten, in a specially prepared Messerschmitt Bf-110 aircraft. Hess took with him a supply of money, toiletries, a torch, camera, maps and medicines, things such as dextrose tablets to fight off fatigue, and several homeopathic remedies. During his mission, Hess tried his hardest to avoid detection from British radar as he flew towards Scotland. But at 10:08 p.m, the British chain home station at Ottercorps Moss near Newcastle detected Hess's aircraft, and the filter room at Bentley Priory was immediately informed. Hess was soon detected by several other radar stations, and the aircraft was designated as, quote, Raid number 42. Whilst the British were aware of an incoming aircraft, they didn't know at this point that it was German Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess. Once the aircraft reached the Scottish coast, Hess flew at just 50 feet above ground level and at high speed to avoid any ground fire. Hess was finding it difficult to spot his destination, Dungavel House. So he tried to reorientate himself by heading for the west coast and then turning back inland. Hess climbed to 6,000 feet and parachuted out of the plane at 11:06 p.m. A Boulton-Paul Defiant interceptor aircraft deployed from RAF Squadron 141 based at Ayr had been pursuing Hess's plane for almost 30 minutes, so Hess had to eject. He injured his foot when he hit the ground, about 12 miles or 19 kilometres west of Dungavel House, the Duke of Hamilton's home. When the British authorities captured him, Hess claimed his mission had been inspired through a dream by supernatural powers. He had consulted his personal astrologer before the flight. Hitler, who was at the Berghof, was furious when he found out what Hess was up to. According to witnesses, Hitler flew into an instant rage, let out an almighty scream that echoed throughout the residence and down the Bavarian Valley when he became aware of Hess's treachery. He immediately summoned a number of his inner circle, concerned that a putsch was underway. Hitler also called Mussolini to assert his steadfast commitment to the Axis war against the Allies. Hitler ordered that German press must now characterize Hess as a madman, executing his foolish British plan without Hitler's knowledge or authority. The press stated that Hess was a deluded and deranged crazy person with deep-seated mental health problems that had been caused by injuries sustained during the First World War. A week later, Hitler initiated, quote, Action Hess. This was a storm of hundreds of arrests of astrologers, faith healers and occultists that took place in June 1941. It was a fickle reversal of Hitler's own beliefs based on what he felt was a betrayal by Hess. Rudolf Hess was imprisoned for the rest of his life by the British, eventually dying by suicide in 1987 after 46 years in captivity. Winston Churchill, in his 1950 autobiography titled, quote, The Grand Alliance, stated that, quote, Hess came to us of his own free will and, though without authority, had something of the quality of an envoy, although his mission was entirely, quote, lunatic benevolence. Joseph Stalin, however, was convinced it was all a British conspiracy. He suspected Churchill of colluding with the Germans to turn against Russia. This, of course, was entirely without merit and couldn't have been further from the truth. Churchill had a deep-seated and firm alliance with Franklin D. Roosevelt, the US president, and their, as Churchill called it, Grand Alliance was more important to him than any other. Whilst the United States and Britain's alliance with Russia was one of convenience, The alliance between the UK and the United States was one of friendship, trust, mutual culture, and historic kinship. Supporting the German Third Reich was never on the cards for Churchill. In fact, Winston Churchill despised Hitler. On June 22, 1942, Churchill said this of Hitler in a speech he gave on Germany's invasion of Russia, quote, "Hitler is a monster of wickedness, insatiable in his lust for blood and plunder." Behind closed doors, Churchill was even more scathing in his thoughts and comments about Hitler. Stating in December 1942 during a British cabinet meeting that at the end of the war, quote, "Adolf Hitler must be sent to the electric chair, executed rather than put on trial for war crimes." These comments were kept away from the public for more than 60 years out of concerns for national security. Karl Kraft, the astrologer who had predicted Hitler's survival, was arrested during Auction Hess and died of typhus while being transported to Buchenwald concentration camp in 1945. The crackdown, however, was selective. One man's occult obsession was not only tolerated, it was entirely encouraged by Hitler. Heinrich Himmler. If Hitler flirted with the occult, then you could say Heinrich Himmler was married to it. His was a love affair of dedicated and deep-planted belief. As Reichsfuhrer of the SS, Himmler transformed the Schutzstaffel, the SS, into a pseudo-religious occult order. He firmly believed the SS were the modern incarnation of ancient Aryan warriors destined to create a master race, a cult of ideology. In 1934, Himmler chose a Renaissance castle called Wewelsburg in Westphalia to serve as the spiritual center of the SS. He spent millions of Reichsmarks renovating it, using slave labor from nearby concentration camps, where prisoners died in the thousands building Himmler's occult fortress. The North Tower contained the most important room, the Hall of the Supreme SS Leaders. Inlaid into the gold and marble floor was a dark green sunwheel. 12 so-called sig runes radiated from the central point. This symbol, now known as the Black Sun, became one of the most powerful occult symbols in Nazi mysticism. Around this symbol, Himmler placed a massive oak table with 12 seats, one for each of his highest-ranking SS generals. He modelled this specifically after the legend of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Here, Himmler conducted secret mystic rituals. Each SS officer had their own chair with a silver name plaque. When an officer died, Himmler held elaborate ceremonies where their coat of arms was burned in a special urn. Beneath the hall was a crypt, a circular stone room with a pit in the centre where the ashes of dead SS leaders were to be placed. Himmler envisioned this as a shrine to the SS eternal flame to provide scientific backing for his occult beliefs. His aim was for it to be the central point for a future Third Reich spiritual Volkisch religion. Himmler also founded the quote, Anerib. The Anerib, German for ancestral heritage, was a pseudo-scientific research organization dedicated to proving Aryan racial superiority. The Anerib, which was based inside the SS, sent expeditions around the world to find evidence of ancient Aryan civilizations, to places like Tibet, Iceland, South America and Eastern Europe. They went to Iceland to study Norse mythology and its link to ancient Aryans, to South America to search for lost Atlantean technology said to have been created by the ancient Aryans, including flying technology. They also conducted horrific human experimentation. They measured Jewish skulls in the thousands in an attempt by Nazi Germany to create an anthropological display to showcase the alleged, quote, Untermenschen, or the racial inferiority of the so-called Jewish race, and to emphasize how the Jews' status as subhumans contrasted to the superior Aryan race. They also studied blood types and the effects of polygal, a substance made from beets and apple pectin, which acted to coagulate blood flow to help with gunshot wounds. Human subjects were given a polygal tablet and then shot through the neck or chest, or had their limbs amputated whilst alive and without anesthesia, all to test the polygal. Additionally, as flight technology was progressing at the time, and Luftwaffe airmen were flying higher and higher, human test subjects were placed in vacuum chambers to test the impact of high-altitude flight on human bodies. The Anarib were also tasked by Himmler with discovering how long German airmen could be able to survive if shot down into freezing water. The test subjects were forced to remain outdoors naked in freezing weather for up to 14 hours, or kept in a tank of ice water for 3 hours. Their pulse and internal temperature was measured through a series of electrodes throughout. Warming of the victim was then attempted by different methods, such as immersion in very hot or boiling water, and also through methods such as placing the subject in bed with a woman who would try to sexually stimulate them, a suggestion by Heinrich Himmler himself. These deadly experiments were performed on concentration camp prisoners, usually innocent Jewish citizens, all in the name of proving their twisted racial theories. Himmler, as I briefly touched upon earlier, also became obsessed with finding mystical artifacts. He believed possessing objects like the Holy Grail or the Spear of Destiny, the lance that pierced Christ's side during his crucifixion, would grant supernatural power and everlasting life to the Third Reich. The SS raided museums, churches and private collections across occupied Europe, stealing thousands of religious and occult artifacts. In fact, in 1938, after Germany annexed Austria, Hitler personally went to Vienna to seize the Spear of Destiny from the Hofburg Palace. Hitler had it transported to Nuremberg, where it was kept under heavy guard. The occult obsession extended even to weapons development. Himmler and other Nazi leaders funded research into wonder weapons based on pseudoscience. Weapons such as anti-gravity devices, death rays, and even attempts to resurrect the dead. One such experiment was the Die Glocke, or the bell. This was an alleged anti-gravity device that was to be powered by some kind of early developed nuclear energy. The Die Glocke is an episode in itself which I will touch upon in the future. But according to Polish intelligence, several German scientists died testing this device between 1944 and 1945. Of course, none of these occult weapons are known or proven to have worked or been successful as far as we're aware, although much of their development and documentation has been lost to history as it was so carefully kept under the strictest secrecy. But the Nazis wasted enormous resources developing these supernatural wonder weapons. Critics will say that the enemies of the Nazis developed real technology, whilst the Nazis' technology was based on pseudoscience. However, the German tech, which we know about, was said to be extremely high quality. The Messerschmitt aircraft, for example. Do you think that Nazi scientists, who the British and Americans would later adopt and work for the Allies for decades developing weapons, the US space program and other technologies, would have really invested huge amounts of time, knowledge and resource on scientific pursuits that were wholly pseudoscientific and of pure fantasy? There is perhaps some hidden truth in there that I will discuss further in our Die Glocke episode. Anyway, by 1945 the Third Reich was collapsing. The occult powers Himmler believed in had failed him, and in March 1945, as Allied forces quickly approached, Himmler ordered Wewelsburg Castle to be destroyed. The SS set fires and detonated explosives, but the castle was only partially damaged before they fled. On May 23, 1945, Heinrich Himmler was captured by British forces in Bremervord. He bit down on a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth and died within minutes. By this point, Hitler had already committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30th. His dream of a 1,000-year Reich had lasted just 12 years. At the Nuremberg trials, many of the surviving Nazi leaders who had been involved in occult activities faced justice. Rudolf Hess, the former Thule Society member who flew to Scotland, was sentenced to life in prison. The Spear of Destiny was recovered by American forces and eventually returned to Vienna, where it remains today in the Hofburg Palace. Wewelsburg Castle survived the war, and today it houses a museum documenting the horrors of the SS and serves as a youth hostel. This is a deliberate and stark contrast to Himmler's dark vision for it. The legacy of Nazi occultism didn't die in 1945, however. The black sun symbol from Wewelsburg Castle has now been adopted by neo-Nazi groups and white supremacists around the world. Modern historians agree that while Hitler and the Nazi leadership were influenced by mystical and supernatural thinking, they were not members of a grand occult conspiracy. The Thule Society did help birth the Nazi Party, but Hitler severed ties with it early on in the 1930s. Himmler's occult obsession was real and extensive, but it was more about creating a pseudo-religious mythology to justify SS power than a genuine belief in magic. The Nazis created much of their occult mythology, and how deeply they believed in it is questionable. But the Nazis used astrology and prophecy primarily as propaganda tools to manipulate public opinion and demoralize enemies. But if they did, it would be a belief in something that they knowingly created and falsified themselves. However, this is a psychological possibility. No amount of occult ritual could separate the Third Reich from the consequences of its evil. There is no amount of mysticism that can excuse their racial hatred and hate theories that they knowingly executed on pseudo-ideologies and entirely created false histories. The story of Hitler's occult obsession is a disturbing chapter in history. It reveals how dangerous pseudoscience, racial mythology, and supernatural thinking can become when combined with totalitarian power. It further reveals the true, wide-ranging grasp and influence that propaganda can achieve on the masses. The Thule Society racist mysticism helped create the ideological foundation for Nazism. Himmler's occult rituals at Wewelsburg turned the SS into a death cult, and the Nazis' use of astrology and prophecy showed how easily supernatural beliefs can be weaponized. The lessons of Nazi occultism remain relevant today. More than ever. In our post-truth climate, the echoes of propaganda, fake news, political creationism, and conspiracy theory are as real as they were in 1930s Germany. Those who use mysticism, religion, and mythology to justify hatred and violence should not be ignored. This is why we remember. This is why we must never forget the dark rituals behind the Third Reich. This was part 2 of our 3-part series into Adolf Hitler. Part 3 will drop after Christmas, but in the meantime, we have some other pressing episodes to share. Thank you all for joining us as always, and thank you so much to our Patreon supporters. If you would like to join our Patreon and gain access to extra episodes, research material, blog posts, and other items, please consider joining us for just $2 a month. The extra content you gain for less than the price of a cup of coffee is hugely good value, but more importantly, it also supports us and the work that we do. If you want to join us, head over to www.patreon.com/deadsouls. See you there, my friends. Good night, everyone.